You are listening to Essence, a podcast about story, journey, and self. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Essence, a podcast about journey, story, and self, and a podcast that I apparently forgot that I was doing. No, I can't even say that. I have, over the past 6 months, been growing in my personal life. I've had some adventures in my professional life, and I am now back to really refocusing on some of the projects that I had started, such as Essence. I want to apologize to some of the guests who I have recorded interviews with and said that I would post them within the next couple of weeks or months. It isn't that I wasn't able to get to it, it was more of with everything else going on. When I did have time to actually sit down and edit these, I just didn't have a chance to get into it, or I didn't have the mood, or whatever, or my computer was lagging. There were issues. It's all a part of the story, right? So over the next couple of days, you're going to see a couple of episodes pop up. One is with my good friend Jade Pichette, and the other is with author and writer Morgan Daimler. Jade is going to be on today. They are a current manager, I believe, of Pride at Work, which is a diversity education training institute or organization that brings diversity education to various corporations and other large-scale bodies. Now, I had originally recorded this about a year ago, so it's been about a year since. So you're going to go from me with my purple hair here to a younger version of myself, and it was fascinating rewatching this episode as I was preparing it for publishing, because I do similar work now with Spectrum in Kitchener and Waterloo. Here I do diversity educating on a team, and that is essentially what Pride at Work does, as well as others, other things. We also talk about, in the conversation that we had together, Jade's work around anti-discrimination in the pagan community, and that was a really important moment a few years ago, and an achievement that Jade was part of in battling against homophobia and racism and other isms in the heathen community, in the Norse Reconstructionist community. And other parts of the pagan community as well. And so we'll get into that. We talk about Jade's background with spirituality and their approach to their queerness and their professional life, and how all of those intersect for them. And one. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today, I am very pleased to have on the show a very good friend of mine who I haven't seen in 3 years, which we need to change, Jade Pichette. Jade Pichette, they, them, is an inclusion and diversity professional based in Toronto. Currently, Jade serves, did I say that right?
Toronto, yeah.
Yeah. Currently, Jade serves as the manager of programs at Pride at Work Canada, where they work with over 150 large employers across Canada around sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression inclusion. Previously, Jade served as the volunteer and community outreach coordinator at the Archives, the education programs coordinator at Kind Space, and they continue to run an independent inclusion and diversity consulting business. They were one of the authors of the Transitioning Employers, a survey of policies and practices for trans-inclusive workplaces. And Jade is also an Asatru Gifia, a priestess of Vindasira Kindred. They have been involved in many interfaith and anti-discrimination initiatives, including being the first trans feminine person to present at the Parliament of World Religions in 2018, which I'm very upset that I didn't actually attend because of previous things I had to do. So Jade, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks, Ben. It's lovely to be here. And I just always like to mention whenever I give presentations that I'm on the Dish with One Spoon territory, also known as Takaranto, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Anishinaabe, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation is the local title treaty holders. And that, today Toronto is home to Indigenous folks from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to be a white settler who is on this territory, but I'm trying to actively undo the impact that many of my ancestors, I should say, have had on this land and on the Indigenous folks of this land, and that's a really important piece for me.
Thank you for that. Thank you for not only acknowledging, but also for sharing. Thank you. So Jade, bring me up to speed with where you've been. So you're now at a completely different place than last time I saw you. Talk to us a little bit about what the work and the programs that you manage are.
Yeah, so in my day job, it's funny, I don't, although my background's in social work, I don't really feel like I'm doing social work anymore, but I still feel like I'm doing social work, if you get my drift. So I work at Pride at Work Canada, which is a national LGBTQ 2+ nonprofit. We're a member services nonprofit, so large employers pay a fee to us, an annual membership fee, and they get access to our programs, which includes everything from webinars to workshops to roundtable discussions, networking events, thought leadership research, as well as some consulting support. And so I'm working with like over 150 companies, essentially. Not all of them are companies, some are government institutions as well, around what does it actually look like to be inclusive of gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation in the workplace. And so I'm the manager of our programs team. So I try to keep an eye on everything that we're doing, whether that's a panel or a in-person roundtable or a networking event, whatever that might be. So it's interesting work, and certainly we've grown a lot in the last couple of years. We actually have a staff team of 8 now, which still sounds pretty small to a lot of people, especially with the amount of companies we work with and the fact that we work in 6 time zones. But it's still feels a lot like we have a lot more support than we used to. So.
Well, and that's one of the key pieces. It seems like it's only been within the past 10 years that inclusivity and inclusion programs have really been pushed at even the corporate level. Friends of mine in the corporate world said that now it's just a routine part of their day and work. But it's really been a journey to get to this point, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. This is actually something that I've been doing some research about. One of my colleagues has been doing some research about, because the first inclusion training and D&I, diversity and inclusion initiatives, really started in connection with the civil rights movement and the second wave feminist movement. Around anti-racism training and anti-sexism training that usually came out of court cases that got put in place. So they were legally mandated to do so. So there were a number of cases in the US, the UK, and Canada in the 70s and 80s in that regard. And so that started to kind of prompt those types of trainings. And then starting in the 90s, you start to see the kind of the first corporate, 2S LGBTQI trainings start to come out, most of which were focused almost exclusively on sexual orientation at the time, but that certainly changed. And also you started to see the rise of the idea of unconscious bias and unconscious bias training. But especially when it comes to like sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression inclusion, many organizations have only really been looking at this in the last 10 years or so, especially in Canada. Like we have some employers who have a longer history, especially the banks that have gone back to the 90s, and also pharmaceutical companies. And part of the reason for that was actually the AIDS activist movement. of the 80s and 90s, and the pressure that was put on pharmaceutical companies who had control of the medications that they were developing at rates that people with HIV/AIDS couldn't access, or the process was too slow. So active engagement with the community really kind of started with that movement. And so there are some who have been looking at it for longer, but yeah, now it's becoming standard. And really one of the reasons for that is because the business case has finally been made. And I feel like the business case is closed. Like the business case is there. Like you don't need to argue it anymore. It's just, it's known. But certainly some industries are a bit slower on the uptake than some others. So for instance, skilled trades is a lot of work to do, as does retail and a number of other industries.
And probably some industries that, you know, those of us in the community would assume are safe spaces or inclusive spaces, and they end up not being, right?
And, you know, even an organization that is in theory committed to these issues of inclusion, you know, it's one thing when you have 5 staff, like you can talk to those 5 staff, you know, and see what the impact is. It's another thing when you have 1,000 or 10,000 or 80,000 staff, to really see whether that's trickling down into all the different offices and regions, and especially people who are more remote as well. Like I've been told some awful stories over the years, which is one of the reasons why I still feel like I'm a social worker sometimes. But the experiences of discrimination that people have had, even in places that you're like, they should know better already, but they don't necessarily.
Yeah, they don't. They don't, and it can be so covert. It can get right underneath, and the person being, at least speaking from personal experience here, you know, when you're a marginalized person of any identity, when a microaggression is taking place, when something is being directed at you, and it is done in such a way that if you say anything, suddenly you're, you know, you use the words from the Black community, being uppity, or being, you know, any of those other microaggressive words, right? Do you find that what am I trying to say here? Do you find that the issues have changed, or the ways that they have come up have changed over your time at Pride at Work Canada?
In the time that I've been here, not so much. I mean, I've been at Pride at Work Canada for a little over 2.5 years, so there hasn't been too much change over that time period, other than obviously COVID and the impact of COVID, which is a huge, a huge change in the inclusion diversity landscape. And then also the Black Lives Matter movement, especially with the death of George Floyd. Here in Toronto, we had the death of Regis Paquette at around the exact same time, that there still is not answers to. And then we also saw the deaths of some Indigenous folks in different parts of the country, including a number of Mi'kmaq folks in New Brunswick. And so, you know, those issues have certainly brought more of issues of Blackness, of indigeneity, and of accessibility to the floor, because accessibility has been talked about a lot under COVID. Though unfortunately, usually is designed for the accessibility of those who are abled, without starting from the accessibility of those who are disabled, which is another thing I've seen. But in terms of the landscape for 2S LGBTQ inclusion, I haven't seen that much changes, other than more organizations realizing that this is something they have to do, and this is something they have to do now. And I think some of them, that wake-up call was when the what was it, Bill C-16, the National Gender Identity and Gender Expression Law went into effect in 2018. And so that had a major impact on all of the federally regulated employers, which includes like all the transportation companies, the telecom companies, the banks, though the banks were usually already addressing those issues. And so for some, it's been that like legislative change that they needed, even though those legislative changes have been happening since 2011, or actually the first was in 2002 in Northwest Territories, which a lot of people don't realize. They were the last to add sexual orientation, but they were the first to add gender identity and gender expression.
Interesting.
Or gender identity, I should say, not gender expression, but gender identity.
Right.
But on a provincial level, you've been seeing that since 2011, 2012 with Ontario, and then rolling out into other parts of the country. And so the conversation in comparison to when I was younger, and because I've been doing this inclusion and diversity, work for over 15 years in different capacities, that conversation has very much shifted to trans inclusion in a way that it wasn't there before. But that's been a longer and more gradual process in comparison to the, very specific reactions that have happened due to Black Lives Matter and COVID.
Right. And it feels, just as a cis individual looking out from the outside in, it feels like there's a lot more of a solid foundation around the trans issues and bringing those issues to the forefront. Feels like there's a more of a solidity.
Yeah, there is, and part of that has come out of court cases. People have organizations have been brought to court for being transphobic, and that certainly helps. But also, we've kind of reached a bit of a like trans tipping point in the last like 5-6 years or so, where so many people have come out. Like as a trans person who's been out for a long time, like I don't think I expected to see this many trans people out. Like, like when I came out, there was not many of us. And now we're everywhere. Like, I mean, we were everywhere before, but we're definitely everywhere now. And also not allowing ourselves to necessarily be pushed out in some of the ways that we allowed before. Not to say that was entirely allowed, because many trans activists fought real hard to make sure that we were included in spaces. But there's, with so many more people who are out as trans, and also so many more kids who are out as, gender creative, gender independent, whatever term you want to use. I don't like labeling children as trans personally. Then you also see all these parents coming into play in a way that I think it's changing the culture on a whole. And so organizations are having to come around to this fact. And in many cases, in the companies that we work with, it's the parents of gender creative kids who are pushing a lot of these changes. But also the solidarity that we're now experiencing, that historically we were denied by a lot of cis, lesbian, and gay communities, is also something that's at play, where more and more cis LGBT or LGBTQ folks are actually stepping up and saying, this isn't okay unless my trans siblings are also okay, and are doing that solidarity work that's very, very well needed. It's an exciting time to be trans, but also still a scary time. Like I know people who've experienced more violence and discrimination because there's more visibility than there was years ago.
And different forms of violence and discrimination. And it does seem like, speaking from another part of the LGBT community, it seems like it's really the kids who are really pushing the progressiveness. Like I love the word gender creative. I love that term, because I think that really gets down to that piece about identity. There's so much, I mean, you go onto Tumblr and you look at the conversations between any of the number of different people in the queer community and the sheer amount of exploration of identity with new terminology that, you know, it certainly wasn't around when we were younger. But it's that emergence of the nuances of identity, which I think that we can all learn from. I think we can all appreciate as well.
And I think it's always important for us to look at how elders have really built this movement, and you know, looking at all the work that elders have done as well. And one thing that I sometimes feel, I sometimes struggle with, is I do occasionally see youth who aren't recognizing that.
Right.
And then I also, on the other side of things, I see elders and olders of our community who don't necessarily always understand the kids as well.
Right. Yes.
But we need to recognize both those histories and those commitments and the dedication and work that's been done before, that has allowed us to get to this point where we can go even deeper. Yes. Where, you know, more and more people can feel comfortable not having to identify as anything. Yep. They just are them, you know. Yes, and I think exactly. I think there will be one day, I don't think it will be within our lifetimes, but I do honestly believe there will be a day where, you know, things like your sexual orientation, your gender identity, and the like won't be as big of identity pieces, because we've reached a place where it's just you're just part of the community in a broader capacity. So
yeah, I think that would be a beautiful thing. I agree. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that we are moving. But at that point, there may be something that we are not even on our radars now that will be the next wave. I'm careful to say that because I don't want to get myself into a mindset of there's always something on, but at the same time, there always is. Yeah. Let's talk about that word elder. And I want to shift a little bit towards eldership when it comes to your personal life. You're a Githia in the Heathenist Satru community. Is that the terminology that you use?
Yeah, either work.
And a Githia is a you don't initiate to become a Githia. You're acclaimed. That's my understanding, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are some people out there who name themselves, where I don't personally feel as comfortable with that. But also, if you don't have a community, if there's no community around you, what else are you going to do, type of thing. But yeah, it's very much about the community recognizing you. And so, you know, I was recognized as a Githia by Austin Lawrence, who's a well-known Gothi in Canada. So that's a male priest within heathenry. Also true, to be specific. And so that was part of that, like, public recognition piece for me. And I have a oath ring that signifies that commitment and that position within my community. And the first of which actually had been gifted to him by the former she who must be obeyed.
Oh, yes. Yes. Ingrid? No.
No.
I know who you're talking about. I can't think.
My brain is not functioning. I've not seen people in too long, but so he had been gifted it by somebody who's Wiccan, actually, but in a leadership position within her community, at his first public ritual, and that was passed down to me and was my recognition of being a Githia. But he had noticed that it was actually cracking because it was made out of tin. And so he connected with my kindred mates from Vindicere, and they pitched in money, and they got me a silver, pure silver oath ring that was then used to reaffirm me publicly as a Githia.
That's beautiful.
So it's, you know, being a Githia, in my opinion, it's about, you know, service to the community. First and foremost. And if you have no community that you're serving whatsoever, you know, they don't have to necessarily be heathen. I've seen people who serve communities in other ways, and it's like, although it's their way of interacting. But I feel like if you aren't serving community in any way, you're not a Githya. You're not a Gothi, you're not a Gothar. That's my perspective. But everybody has different perspectives on being clergy within heathenry, because it doesn't have a initiatory style tradition, and it's not a closed practice, unlike many other practices out there that are. And we're a small community too, right? You know, there's probably about 1,000 heathens, maybe 2,000 at max, within Canada. A good chunk of those are people I don't want to interact with in any way, because they are not inclusive. Let's put it that way. We can get more into that if we would like later. And then so that this leaves, you know, this much smaller inclusive community that is very spread out across a very, very large landmass, right? So yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. Like my kindred were spread out between you know, the Toronto area, Kitchener, Waterloo, and London, Ontario. And so that's kind of our triangle of where our members are. But our members are throughout those three, you know, main regions. And we have a couple people in between those main regions. And so, you know, that for us works primarily because we step up and make sure that people have rides to events. Obviously nobody's going anywhere right now, but it's been very odd trying to organize ritual online, for instance. But you know, we try and create that space, and you know, there is a community that I'm serving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What does that service look like for you on a personal level?
So on a personal level, it means that I feel responsible for those building of community ceremonies. And I will go out of my way to dedicate that time and energy, even when I'm less able, you know. You know, like I previous to COVID, I had done 2 weddings that previous year in 2019. And it was not easy to do those ceremonies. One was in Peterborough and one was in London, neither of which are cities that I live in. And I don't have a car, but I still committed to doing those ceremonies. I still went, I served the community, you know, and I served those folks who needed somebody who was in a clergy role, who would be understanding of them. And you know, for me, there's really an intersection between the heathen community, but also with queer and trans communities.
Right.
Because I also see queer and trans communities as my community. And frankly, most of the heathens that I spend my time with, that I give service to, are not exclusively queer or trans.
Yeah.
But there's a lot, you know. And like one of those wedding ceremonies I actually did was a secular ceremony. Even though for me, I still had religious aspects that were less evident, because that's fulfilling the practice for myself, and my relationship that I have with the deities that I have, and the commitments that I have to them, essentially, is making sure that I fulfill that. But yeah, for me, it also looks like being willing to step up in the face of people who are using our faith to harm others.
Yes.
And so for me, part of that service is doing that work.
Yes.
Again, this is just my personal experience and the way that I see things. But I see that commitment as something I need to do.
Yes.
And even with Vindicere, we've changed to a anti-hierarchical model, because moving my politics into my religion is something I do. And so everybody who is a member of Vindicere, who is sworn an oath, who's been to our events for over a year, and then also everybody we have consensus about who those new members are. Everybody in that group has a vote. So at the end of the day, if people came around and said, we're not comfortable with you being Githya anymore, like I would step down, right? I don't think that's going to happen,
Right.
but like that possibility is there, and that commitment to me is really something that I have to keep doing. The other piece is making sure that I'm providing a certain amount of education to my kindred mates and to the people in community. And so that includes, sharing knowledge in regards to the tradition that I've acquired, includes doing more research. It's one of the many religions with homework,
Yes.
And so for me, I see myself as responsible for doing some of those pieces, for me to feel comfortable to identify myself as a Githya.
Right.
Like for me, it's an active status, and not something I just, I just have, as a title.
It's not just a title that you lap onto the end of,
Exactly.
of your name. Yeah, it's an active relationship with the community. Yeah. I as you were talking, I remembered a scene from a few years ago, and I know you may have a shudder from this. You were talking about oath and that consensus piece. There was a gathering that we were at, and it was later on at night, and I think somebody stood up and they almost said, I swear, and all of the Asatru in the group shuddered like, oh, no, because of that oath piece. If you hear somebody's oath, you are bound to that oath. Am I getting that right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
But the thing is you can also deny the oath. Right. So, but that requires you speaking up. That requires you speaking up and saying, this is not the space for that. We do not take that oath. We do not accept that oath. And somebody has to be in that role. At Hail and Horn, for instance, we have what's known as the Thule. And the Thule is responsible for if anybody's read Beowulf, for example, the Thule is names are escaping me today. It's just one of those days. But the person who goes up and questions Beowulf and basically says, I don't believe you that you outswam a monster. I don't believe you on this thing and this thing. And it's up to Beowulf to prove those pieces before Beowulf can swear that oath to the king. Right. And in our tradition, that is a sacred role. So that role is one where they are responsible for making sure that if something is sworn, that it's done in a way that is respectful of the community and is one that people can actually maintain. Because yes, you become responsible in our tradition for that oath if you are there and you allow it. And it was that in particular was an issue of like interfaith misunderstanding and conflict, I think, because there is a certain way that things are stated in Wiccan communities in particular, where that's more allowable. But for all the heathens, it is a very serious thing, and not to say that it isn't serious for Wiccans too, because it is.
Yeah. In a different
way. The way that it's understood is different. So for us, we see that as our responsibility if that is sworn in public. And so very rarely do we swear oaths, or do we recommend swearing oaths. It's something that if you were to ever do, you better be doing it with the right people, and you better be able to back up your word.
Right.
And also set things like your timeline.
Mm.
Like I think of it like a project plan. What's your timeline? How are you going to be accountable if you don't complete it? You know, what is going to be the shield or repayment? Because if you don't complete an oath, the people that you didn't complete the oath to also have an impact on them. They have an impact on their weird. They have an impact on their heminia, their luck. You know, there is a lasting impact on not just that person. And so what is the thing that can be done to rectify that situation? And you know, I mentioned the treaties, for instance, at the beginning of our call,
Yes.
and that's a good example of oaths that weren't upheld, right?
Yes.
And so, as I think of things like the Two-Row Wampum that talks about, you know, Indigenous folks and settlers working in tandem, but separately, but in good relationship with each other. And so even though with the Two-Row Wampum you see two different lines in it, you know, that relationship is one that was broken. And so it is up to us, those of us who are white settlers, to rebuild that relationship and pay that shield, in my perspective.
Yes.
Because those oaths were broken, and that still has a rippling impact on us,
Right.
due to the actions of our ancestors or the ancestors of the settlers on this land, right? And the fact that we benefit from this system that was a broken oath.
Yes.
You know, the way that the treaties are taken up, the land treaties, the water treaties, because that's the water treaty is a water claims is a big piece right now. It's a real question of how do we help address that? And I mean, there are explicit things in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of this is what you need to do to fix this. And I see it very similarly with personal oaths as well.
Yes.
It's like this experience of you have not committed to doing the thing that you have committed to, you didn't do the thing that you committed to do, that has caused harm. How are you going to repay for that harm? The harm doesn't go away.
No.
But you mitigate the impact that harm had.
Yeah.
So I see that very similarly in my inclusion work. And so for me, it's really about dovetailing those two things.
Yes.
And I know this is something you want to get into in a bit more detail. So,
well, and a point to that, because as you were talking, so one of the kind of key features of my own practice is a lot of narrative work and story work, right? And how, you know, when historical issues and present issues that stem from that historical issue, how that has been reframed by different people based on their agendas, based on not wanting to take responsibility, not wanting to look at the story. And so a story is created, a myth is created that makes it better, right? That issue is very present in your community right now around racism, homophobia, ism of all sorts of different kinds. And I've seen the literature from the groups that you have denounced and your community have denounced, and they are appalling. So let's talk about that idea of the story, because there are heathen groups, there are Asatru groups out there, heathen Asatru groups out there, who have taken up the sacred stories of your tradition and used them as a cover for hatred, homophobia, colonialism, all of these isms. Can you talk a little bit about that then?
Yeah, so
and what you did to
it. So you know, when it comes to especially white supremacy and heathenry, because usually those other isms tend to dovetail into white supremacy, I do see them as all connected in different ways. They're not the same, but they are connected. I think that, you know, talking about this idea of narrative and story is actually something that's really interesting for the heathen community, because the inclusive heathen community has created this narrative as if these racist groups are appropriating our symbols, are appropriating our history, are doing that. But the reality is that the modern heathen Germanic revival really started much earlier. It started in the 1800s with the Germanic revival movement, which imagined this, mythological white past that was, fictional in comparison. We have evidence from archaeological records that, that is not how people engaged. And, even the idea of race, xenophobia goes back throughout human history, but racism is a product of colonization and colonial violence. And so it was during that period of this colonial expansion, especially in places like a lot of Africa was being colonized at the time, and also the rest of Turtle Island. BC didn't become part of Canada until the 1800s, or British North America, I should say. And so, we have created this narrative that they have appropriated us. But the reality is that our movements would not exist without the grounding of those racist movements that originated in the 1800s in this pagan Germanic revival, that also influenced the Nazis. And that there is a direct correlation there. That's not to say that, modern heathens were taking what Nazis did, or taking this Germanic revival across the board. Because a lot of these groups have actually been formed independently of any of those groups, sometimes without even knowing the history. So the BC heathens are an interesting example of that. They created their own heathen tradition, not knowing that what was going on in other parts of the world. So they have this long, interesting history going back to the 80s that is very distinct than any other heathen group in Canada. And so, although these are independent, our movements have this historical whiteness, have this historical racism. And so we actually have to change the narrative where we admit the past and address the present. And that's the whole idea of truth and reconciliation, right? Like you can't start without truth. And so we have to give truth to that first, and then look at how we address the fact that they are using these symbols in these racist ways that aren't a long-term history in terms of the history of these symbols, but still have a history that we have to be honest about and that we have to take responsibility for. Because I feel like sometimes we create this narrative of they're just appropriating us. So it's not our responsibility. And like, it is our responsibility. It is. And to just not take responsibility for that is the same way that I see some Christians totally dismiss extremist Christians. I see, Muslims who dismiss extremist Muslims, and although in Canada there's a whole additional narrative with that because of the Islamophobia and racism that Muslim groups experience, but we have to take responsibility and we have to address it. And like some of the ways that we have looked at doing that is the Declaration 127. When you see misdeeds, you have to address it essentially. But also locally, we created the Canadian Pagan Declaration on Intolerance in 2016. And I was the person who led that effort. But as time goes on, declarations feel more and more empty to me personally. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to take the Pagan Declaration down. Like, I think it still was an important piece at its time. It brought together conversation. And we've had a number of groups sign on in this past year because of like the BLM movement and others. But that declaration doesn't, there's no accountability process. There's no checking in to see like in detail, how do BIPOC folks feel about this group? Like, does this group actually practice what they preach? Because I think that's still an issue, and one that we need to also look within our communities. We can't just say that, oh, we're inclusive, we welcome everybody, everybody's the same. No, everybody's not the same.
Yeah.
People experience different things in the world, and we need to actively talk about that and address that if we're going to make an inclusive space.
Yes.
We can't pretend that we're somewhat outside of that, especially those of us of mostly European descent who are in traditions that are based out of European traditions, which aren't ancient in the way that some of them portray themselves to be. They're not ancient. They're influenced by ancient traditions, but they're not ancient. They're revivals, right? Or independently created movements, and those, are recent, and they were started and bred and grow under white supremacy.
Yes. Yes.
And so, subtle signs of white supremacy and homophobia and transphobia and all of these pieces are integrated into these traditions and our communities, and we have to address that.
Very much so. No, I completely agree with you. This conversation, although the declaration came out of the heathen and Asatru community, this conversation can be applied to every single form of paganism out there, neo-paganism out there. The conversation in Druidry right now is very, and it's fascinating because it's the same faces, just different words. Right? It's the same conversations, like Obod, because Obod has now become Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. My viewers will know them because I've spoken to quite a few people from Obod. When that came to North America, it was very much grounded in the British tradition, right? British landscape, British people, right? But like the social context of Britain is very different from North America. There is white supremacy there, absolutely. It's in a different form. There's been reports of OBOD groups in the States which don't include BIPOC people. Well, this is only for British people. This is only for, descendants of British, of British, if you don't have any connection of that land. And the administration of OBOD came down hard on that group, on those groups, right? But it's one of those things where it's like, I feel like in the pagan communities, especially when it does come to European traditions, there can be a willing blindness to the issues. Oh, well, I'm coming just because I don't want to be political, or, I've seen that on a number of different Facebook groups. And it always strikes me as very well, if your religion and your spirituality is not political, then it's naive.
Yeah, and it just upholds the systems of oppression that are there, and that's a issue that I see, especially also with accessing different pieces of others' traditions as well, because that's another thing that's a serious issue, and also a reproduction of white supremacy in pagan communities, is this idea that anything is accessible. Anything is, we're in the 21st century. Anything can be, something that you connect with, and if you connect with it, then you can do it. And it's like, no, actually certain things you can't. And like, you can't profit and gain sometimes actual money, as well as prestige, for doing things that BIPOC folks are actively being penalized for without connection to BIPOC communities. Like, you can't do that. I mean, people do, obviously, because white supremacy is rampant in pagan communities, in my opinion. But it's still something that people don't seem to be ready for the conversation about, where it does go to this, well, I don't want to make it political, And it's like, look around.
Yeah.
There's a reason why there aren't many BIPOC folks here, because they show up, they experience racism,
Hmm.
they experience like colonization violence,
Yes.
and then they leave. You know, and I've seen so many BIPOC pagans who have done that over the years, who
Yeah.
have come to events, they experience racism in whatever form, and then they leave. And you know, sometimes that's like covert microaggressions, as you were saying. But I think the thing that people don't realize is that outward explicit aggressions are still very much happening in workplaces, in every community. And you know, Canada's not fully the bastion of inclusion that we portray on a world stage.
Yeah.
um, and you know, I think that we could learn a lot from looking at other countries and the way that they are dealing with things as well. And also actually addressing the fact that Canada is directly profiting off of Indigenous communities in very harmful ways, continuing to this day. And so we can't, um, I don't feel like we can move forward as a community without recognizing that.
Absolutely.
If we actually care about having people of all backgrounds, not just in our spaces, but part of our spaces
Yes. Yes.
from the very beginning. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people also don't realize is microaggressive is, and this came up this past weekend at a conference I was at, was this idea of letting people into spaces.
Right.
Like, let's
Right.
let the BIPOC folks have their discussion. You know, let's let them have input. And it's like, no, they should be,
Yeah.
you should, this isn't just about letting people do anything.
Yeah.
It's making sure that they're included on a deep, meaningful level and that forms of discrimination are dealt with.
And
Because
challenging those underlying assumptions as well. The
exactly.
assumption that you have, but that comes back to that narrative piece, right? White supremacy is built on that narrative of superiority. Well, we'll let them have it.
Yeah.
As if you have the right to give some that to them in the first place. And also that theming, you know, them.
Yeah. And I
Huge.
mean, we're the one, we're both white and we're having this conversation, right? And I always want to reinforce that we should be listening to
Mm-hmm.
BIPOC leaders in what they're saying, and then also they should be compensated for the work that they do.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, like I'm willing to do some of that like white settler solidarity work, especially seeing as I see myself marginalized in multiple areas. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, on a truly selfish note, I honestly believe that if we decolonized, that it would be a safer and more welcoming space for me as somebody who's mostly of white settler descent.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't think about is that these systems, they harm all of us, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in religious spaces. It
Yes.
harms all of us, and we all lose out
Yes.
from them.
Yes.
Even those with that privilege, we still lose out because we have to play into a narrative if we want to retain that privilege. And if we leave that narrative, we get penalized for it.
Yes. Yes.
Not in the same way that BIPOC folks get penalized for existing, but even still.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then also, we don't get to, you know, have the full breadth of human experience in multiple ways.
Yes.
You know, there would be, if Indigenous communities were leading things in you know, Northern Turtle Island where we sit, there would be more discussions around issues of accessibility. There would be more
Yes.
discussions around how do we include people
Yes.
regardless of, you know, these ideas of orientation or identity. You know, how do we create healing spaces?
Mm-hmm.
And I say this because Indigenous communities are already doing this. You know, they're
Absolutely.
already doing
Yes.
that work
Yes.
and have been doing that work for a long time.
Absolutely.
And by upholding white supremacy, not only do we harm our other people, we harm ourselves,
Yeah.
and we lose out on the, you know, amazing things that could be brought, not just through, you know, people of different cultural backgrounds, but also through a diversity of thought.
Exactly.
You know?
Yes.
And diversity of thought has major impacts. Like looking at my work, for example, diversity of thought is understood in
Right.
a lot of corporate spaces as it bringing innovation.
Mhm.
It brings better results. It brings, you know, all of these things. And so if we were actually doing that in a real concerted way, both as communities, religious communities, but also on a whole, I think we would be in a much better state than we are now.
Much healthier state.
Yeah.
A much healthier state. Jade, can I ask you, throughout your work in all the various parts of your life that we've talked about today, what have you learned about yourself? Sitting here in February 2021, what have you learned about yourself? It's a big question.
It is a big question. I guess just kind of going off of this train is how much of white supremacy I internalized
Right.
over the years. And that is a really like interesting thing to come to terms with. One of the pieces that's been really helpful for me for that has actually been this book, Me and White Supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
by Lalia Saad. And it's a really it's the subtitle is Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor.
Right.
And she really talks about this like intersection of you know, whiteness and white fragility, and it is designed for white people to actually uncover the white supremacy that is, you know, delved deep into us,
Yeah.
so that we actively act in a more inclusive and welcoming way, and that we actually
Mm,
act in solidarity with BIPOC communities.
yes.
Because BIPOC communities are already doing the work, right?
Yes.
Like they're already doing the work. We need to support them in what they're already doing instead
Yeah.
of taking the lead on a
Not
lot of these
relegating them
issues.
to the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That too.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to be picking that book up. A huge part of my work right now is around ancestral work, and what emerges on a routine basis is individuals who have a heritage from multiple places around the world, and they come across that ancestor who held views of that were not in line with how they're feeling now, or what society is now, and that relationship piece, that breakdown in that relationship, being a good ancestor, and also being a good ancestor in waiting, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. I in many ways I feel like ancestral work um is usually, not always,
Mm.
but is usually a like powerful act of decolonization.
Yes, it is.
Because it's, you know, both connecting yourself to your past, and for me, ancestor is not necessarily only a blood. And I think that's really important and something that a lot of people don't think
Yes.
necessarily.
Yes.
When they think ancestor, they think directly and only a
Yes.
blood. Um, but you know, doing that work, both healing your ancestral line who was harmful
Yes.
and healing your ancestor line who's harmed.
Yes.
You know, as much as I don't agree on everything that Starhawk says, for instance, she does have this quote about how, you know, every single one of us has oppressed and oppressor
Mm-hmm.
within us.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that since I was young has stuck with me in a very deep way.
Yes.
And you know, I think about that on multiple levels. Like most of my ancestors are white settlers who had a lot of privilege in that way. But I grew up poor. I'm disabled. I'm trans. I'm non-binary. You know, like I have all these other intersections that come into play in terms of the oppressions that I experienced.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons why sometimes I like to think about being a co-resistor with
Mm.
Indigenous communities, in working in solidarity. That's one of the reasons why I like the word solidarity, because there's different ways to fight, and you need to fight together. And I think that's something that activist groups especially used to do really well and now don't do very well with. I feel like very few coalitions are actually built across different communities in a way that they used to be. But I think we can still talk to those ancestors to get that advice of how we do that in future in a good way.
Of wisdom, yes. Jade, thank you so much. We are coming to time. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I hope that you'll be able to come back and talk to us in detail more about some of the things we maybe glossed over in this interview. Thank you so much. It was lovely to see you.
Thank you so much, Ben, and I look forward to talking more in future.
If people want to learn more about you and your work, and where can they go?
So there's a few different spaces. Obviously, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter, just as Jade Pichette. And also, I'm accessible either through my day job, being Pride at Work Canada, so prideatwork.ca, or through my own personal consulting website, being Jade Pichette, Pichett, at .com. Sorry, not the email address, jadepichette.com.
Perfect. I will put those down in the show notes. And if anybody is interested, especially therapists who are in my field of work, who really want to bring that into their practice. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.